Okay, advanced higher historians, so now that we kind of have an idea about what advanced higher history is going to be like, and we've had a chat about the inquiry skills and things, I thought we would just jump right into some content stuff. So this is a kind of little introduction to the kind of who's who that we're going to be talking about, and about kind of Russia in general. So I'm going to go through this one. There will be things for you to do at the end, and in theory this will be your week 2 PowerPoint for the first half of the week, and then there will be another PowerPoint with other tasks to do at the other half of the week so that we don't fall behind. So learning intention for this particular lesson is to think about why this particular topic. So why have we chosen to do Russia and not one of the other ones that are available, to look at some particular aspects of what the topic is maybe going to include. The first context we're thinking about is Russia in revolution, and 3 success criteria points for you here. You can, by the end of this, explain a little bit about how Russia actually looked at the point in time that we are talking about. You know who the people that we are discussing are, and you might already know some of them, so that's perfect. And you should be able to describe what a revolution actually is and what your ideas about a revolution might actually be, because they might be different from other people's. For each lesson this year, unlike at higher, you will be given a reading assignment for you to do, which will relate to the stuff in the lesson, and we'll give you more information. It's from the course textbook. The digital copy of the textbook is on the team, but I will also attach it with this lesson set when I put the instructions up in the team and on the school website, where you'll be able to download it as a PDF as well. Anyone who has difficulty with PDFs as screen readers and things, let me know, and I will see about getting a different style document for you for that. So, age-old question, why do we bother? What is the point of all of this? And it's a great question, really. Why are we bothering with this particular topic? Apart from the fact that, honestly, it is one of my favourite parts of history, it is actually arguably one of the most important events of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution leads to the creation of the very first ever communist state, which then lasts for 70 years, so a communist experiment as it was originally described, that then lasted for 7 decades and impacted the world for generations further in ways that we are still actually living under the stereotypes and the fallout of this years and years and years later in 2020. So this is kind of like a foundation piece of 20th century history. It is one of the cornerstones of it, and its influence can be seen throughout European history, throughout world history, and obviously at higher we looked at the Cold War, but you can see how this part here that we're discussing now will later on lead into that, and other information will come about that as well. The reality is the revolution in Russia and this whole period terrified countries all over the world with the philosophy of communism, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were the writers of this particular philosophy, created something that became almost bigger than the original theory was supposed to be. And it gets to the point where the Western areas view this, and I should say as a kind of virus that basically has to be stopped at all costs. It's almost like a barge pole moment. That is an infected thing. It's infected with communism. It has to stay away. And that kind of philosophy starts to trickle into other aspects of life. You have things like the Red Scare in America during the period of kind of the 50s and the 60s and things. You've got the Cold War and elements of that there, and even today this idea of communism is still seen as a very taboo thing, but this is where it originally comes from. And then obviously we've got this impact on internal politics and foreign policies after World War II, which ultimately leads Russia to emerge as a superpower that is competing with the United States. It then leads to the Cold War, and ultimately the development of other communist places, for example China and things like that. So the reason that we bother is because this is a cornerstone piece of history, and it is a really important and really interesting one. Now, kind of a health warning on this, mental health warning, you are going to get very frustrated with these people and very frustrated with the actions of those, but I need you to remember that everyone has 20/20 hindsight, so it's great to look back now and say, oh, but this is what they should have done. You have to remember they were doing what was within their powers to do at that point in time, so definitely worthwhile keeping that in mind as we go through it. If you get frustrated, feel free to let us know. That's what the group chat is there for, and we can have a talk about that. So Russia as a historical topic is huge. It is literally like this picture of an iceberg, and the question is, where do we actually start on this? So we have to break off a small sort of piece of it. So to get an understanding of the revolutions of 1917 and then what happened afterwards, we really need to go back to look at the country state in the 1900s, what it was actually like then, and the information that we actually have about it that could lead to this. And I know some of you have talked about your Sean Lang reading and the sort of the conditions of the peasants and things like that in the countryside, so we will come back to that. We're going to look at the structure of Russia under the Tsar, so the Tsarist regime. You might see this word spelt with a C, so C-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R, it is still the same person. It is the Russian sort of term for emperor, the Tsar, king or emperor. So we're looking at how his regime is established and how it ultimately collapsed. And then we're going to talk about the Bolsheviks, who were a political group. Ultimately, they would become led by Lenin, who you will know the name of, even if you don't know much about him, and how they ultimately gained power, but then not just gaining it, managed to maintain it to the point where Joseph Stalin starts to come in, and how he actually managed to gain power, retain power, and not only that, but turned very much a backwards agricultural nation who was decades behind the rest of the world in terms of development into a superpower that, when we talk about the Cold War period, was very capable of standing toe to toe with America, and what we saw at a higher level with that in detail as well. The really cool thing that I like about the Russian history part is that we are still finding out more and more information about it. It is a continuously evolving period in history because we get more information as more documentation is released or other historians go into more research and more data about that. So this is still very much alive as a piece of history development today, which is very cool. And I say that because I'm a history geek, but I'm fine with that. And that is basically why bother and where we're going to start with this. So Russia itself. In case anybody has not seen a map recently, this is a map and the bit in red is Russia. It is absolutely ginormous, and that is going to be really important because the general over sort of scale of it, this huge scale of Russia, makes things very, very difficult for getting information and memos and just general orders and laws and things like that passed, and really getting people to listen to you and to believe what you're actually saying and to do as you're saying if you are in control of this country. It is a very difficult country to control, especially at this point in time. So we will have some sympathy for Tsar Nicholas, but it is gigantic, and that is an important point that we're going to make. Looking at it in a little bit more detail, you can see it is divided up into different sections. The bits that we are really talking about, where what we'd maybe refer to as like the action zones, where things happen, are actually mostly around sort of this corner that I'm just kind of drawing around. This is generally where we are talking about. So if you actually think about that, it's this whole other part of Russia is more or less kind of there, but without as much industry. There's not an awful lot of factories and cities and things like that. It's mostly in these areas that you find that. So again, that's going to become important later on. I just thought this was kind of a nice map for you to see where things actually are. It's quite useful. So very like the Roman Empire before it, in the 1800s, Russia is an empire colonizer. It is a country that is taking over lands that are nearby. It is taking things, and it is running itself as an empire, an overseer of all of these different places. In the 1900s, it then forms the Soviet Union, and today it is often just called Russia or the Russian Federation. In each of these different time periods, Russia has colonised, controlled, or entered into agreements with its neighbour states to keep a kind of overview of that entire region of the world that it is obviously established in. Now, 1991 kind of onwards from the Russian Federation, so say Russia today, the bit in green, the border in yellow. 17 million square kilometres. If you think about how many countries it actually borders, okay, it is quite a number, and there are some other little patches of control that you can see as well. If I highlight kind of the green bits there, okay. So these bits are obviously still controlled by Russia. However, between 1918, so end of First World War, and 1991 when that happened, Russia is much bigger than this. You can see that the border of today's Russia is actually still there, and you can see that there's actually spillover from other areas that used to be part of Russia. It was bigger, so 22.4 million square kilometres, and ruled by Moscow's Communist Party. A lot of what would be the present day Russian neighbours were still part of the Soviet Union, and they still were controlled more or less by Moscow. Jump back in time again, so 1781 until 1917, so that kind of period, just before Russia's end of the First World War, and it is much, much bigger. Again, the yellow line shows you what the borders of Russia today are, so you can actually see that there's quite a lot of spillover there. It is 22.8 million square kilometres. It is ruled by the Russian Tsars at this point in time, so one person in control of all of this green sort of space. The dark green is direct rule, and the light green is influence. So that means that they maybe have their own parliament, or they have their own people in charge, but they still take orders and influence from the Tsars, and the Tsars in charge of that as well. Really interesting bit is that actually part of the USA at this point in time between 1781 and 1917 was also part of Russia. So very much a coloniser, very much in control. And because it had been ruled by the Tsars for so long, they had this strange belief that they were actually in control of all of this. Very, ancient Roman, very kind of emperor-conqueror sort of mentality. But you can see why, considering that they had kept this amount of space and land for so long. It seems a very ego-inflating sort of situation. So, by the magic of PowerPoint, we can actually see these pictures on top of one another, so you can see as time goes on how the Russian Empire starts to condense and fall back to this yellow line. So slowly, like that. And this is the Russia that we know and love today. So, that's Russia, just in case anybody had missed that. We're now thinking about the people. Okay. So first up in our who's who is Tsar Nicholas, and you can see him and his wife in this picture here, dressed in their most opulent finery, as is befitting a Tsar of Russia. He was an autocrat, which is a word that is used to describe an all-powerful ruler who has literally supreme and complete power over every aspect of his domain, all of his subjects, everything. Genuinely, Nicholas had been born into a family that had been this particular type of ruler for a very long time, and he believed that autocracy was the best way in order to rule Russia, and that any move whatsoever, even slightly towards democracy, would lead to revolution and to chaos and ultimately to ultimate collapse, really, of Russia. Like, Russia would no longer exist as it kind of does in this point in time. It would be a waste of his legacy, a waste of his ancestry and everything if he even remotely gave any ground on modernising or trying to create any sort of democracy, which other countries at this point in time were starting to do. Eventually he does try to modernise Russia when his hand is kind of forced in 1905, which we'll come back to. But he tries to do it in an already outdated state. So pretty much it's like he tries to force the modernisation onto a country that there is no foundation in. Kind of like trying to pour water into a glass but not actually putting a glass there. Or having one that is, I don't know, made of cheese with holes in it or something. Wasn't my best metaphor, but anyway. So generally speaking, it is needed to industrialise and to basically make this glass a full, sturdy foundation with which to pour modernisation into. And he needs to do this if his country is going to stay a world power. But rather than actually see that maybe he's in the wrong and maybe that the situation as Russia stands is wrong, which is why they're falling behind, he takes it to be that the little that he has allowed is putting people off. And they're off their game and they're no longer completely under his control, which means Russia is losing authority, which is a very bad thing. So he's supposed to be this fantastic ruler, and genuinely when he comes to power the people were very excited, but there's a problem with him. Generally he's not a particularly gifted ruler. He gets it by default because of blood, but he's unsuited to the general task of ruling, and he's not prepared to make the sort of political and social changes that are needed to modernise Russia. So any attempt that he does make to modernise, and he desperately does need to, is half-hearted, not particularly focused and not particularly useful. This, with then the added stress and strain of World War I, prompted complete revolution in Russia. Or at least that's one interpretation. And here's where historiography comes in. There are certain historians who would argue that the fact that Nicholas was unsuited to ruling and his inflexibility, along with the stress of World War I, is what prompted revolution. There are others that would argue that actually the situation in Russia had been brewing for a very long time, and the First World War was the catalyst for it, certainly, but it wasn't necessarily the main contributing factor. And again then there are other historians that think that had the war not happened, it is very likely that Nicholas would have modernised and would have changed, and things would have just kept ticking over the way they had done in Russia for a very long time. So this is one way that we can use historiography to build a picture of what the arguments might be. So you pick the one that you actually think makes the most sense to you, or that you agree with, because you are historians and it is your opinion, and you use that as an illustrated point, and then you can use any opinions from historians that disagree with you to create a discussion in your essays and in your dissertation, and you can explain what the other perspective is, but then you can add detail that emphasises whatever you are thinking and what your argument is, even if it's against whatever that particular perspective is talking about. Just because they are published and written in articles and in textbooks and things and in other books does not mean that their opinion is any more valid than yours is, because you are a student of history just as they are, and as long as you can back up your opinion, you can literally argue whatever you like. That is the key point for this year that you have to think about. So, how the Tsarist regime actually worked in Russia at this point in time. You've got a couple of different branches. At the very top, you have the Tsar. Autocrat, absolute power. He makes laws himself. He can appoint and dismiss ministers at whim whenever he feels like it, and he refuses to consider any sort of national parliament because that would be weak. He is a family man, is Nicholas. His wife, which we saw in the other picture, Tsarina Alexandra, is a German national who has obviously married into his family, and she wants him to be at home, and he likes to be at home with his wife and children. So he doesn't actually really care about being in sort of parliamentary meetings or anything like that, or any sort of meetings with ministers. He would rather be at home, so if the meeting goes on or it takes a turn he doesn't like, he just leaves, in which case nothing can get done. Under him, you have the civil service. Each department in the civil service is run by a minister. They basically have one simple job. It's to make sure that, well, two simple jobs. Make sure that the Tsar's commands are always carried out the way he wants them, when he wants them, and to collect taxes to fund all of the Tsar's things that he wants. We then have the secret police, because obviously no country is complete without a secret police force, which is called the Okhrana. It is run by a minister. Its job is, again, twofold. Prevent criticisms of the Tsar. You are not allowed to speak out against the Tsar. That is a very big no-no. You do not criticise the Tsar. You do not speak against the Tsar. You are for the Tsar and only for the Tsar. And they also arrest anyone that they suspect of criminal activity or speaking out against the Tsar or against the Orthodox Church, which we'll come back to in a second. And they try them in special courts, and basically that is it. They are now more or less done for. You also have the power force behind the Tsar, which is the army. Now they're going to be really important in the 1905 revolution, and I'll explain, and 1917, and I'll explain why when we get there. But I want you to keep that in mind. They are the largest peacetime army in the world at this point in time, with 2.6 million people. And they have a very simple job. Help the police maintain law and order. That is it, because there is no war happening all the time, so they only need to be there to protect the Tsar and keep law and order that the Tsar then decides. The ministers then make sure is carried out, and the secret police punish if they don't do it. The other group that you have here is the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church is basically the official Russian version of Christianity. The priests taught that it was a sin to oppose the Tsar. It is a cardinal sin, which means that you can go to hell for that. And you must treat the Tsar like a mini god. Basically, God was above the Tsar, but nobody was above God, and nobody was at the same level as the Tsar. The Tsar was kind of like a mini god. The Tsar's old tutor and advisor was both the head of the church and a minister, so he was really the only one that the Tsar would listen to at the point in time that we are looking at. And their main job is literally to teach the people that the Tsar is good, the Tsar is God, the Tsar's word is like the word of God, and they should always follow it. Other people that we have Lenin. Fantastic mugshot of him here. He is a follower of Karl Marx, and basically what he does for Russia is he brings in Marxism with his own personal twist on it. He believes in a sort of a disciplined revolutionary party, which should be run by professional revolutionaries, if you can imagine such a thing existing. And he argued that they would seize power in Russia and then go on to spread this communist ideal, this utopia, to the rest of the world. In 1917, in October, technically revolution number 3 for Russia, he hijacked the revolution with his party, the Bolsheviks, and they took power and set up the original communist state. Poor Lenin then faced a few grueling years of unrest and civil war, trying to keep power, and he only lived long enough to see his regime actually secure before he then died of a massive series of strokes, so no revolution for the world for him. But we'll come back to him in a bit more detail. Now, we've mentioned him a couple of times. Karl Marx, who is a philosopher, has a fantastic beard, and is actually a very clever person. He believed that human history passed through what he calls a series of evolutionary stages which led to socialism. This is a point where the workers control the state and everyone is a worker and everyone is equal. Wealth is shared equally between everything, and then from there you move on to communism. So socialism comes first and then you move on to communism. And for him, communism was a state where there is no control of anything by anyone as an individual. Everything is shared equally. Machines pretty much make everything, and you have much more time for leisure and for volunteering, and it is the highest form of society. It is a utopia for him. And he argued that the only way for you to get this is to go first through capitalism make all of the money you could to finance and fund, and then distribute the wealth and go from there. It would be through working class revolution is what he thought would happen. And he talks about it being very much like a train station sort of ideal, where each sort of stage takes you through a different point. And you must get off at each individual station before you can get back on the train in order to get to your final destination. Now, Lenin does not do that. He takes the train in a different direction and bypasses some stations to kind of speed the journey up a little bit. But we'll come back to looking at that in more detail. If you're actually interested in this idea of what a theoretical communist society from the philosopher's point of view would look for, I would really recommend a book called The Giver. It is also a film. If you are interested in going away and watching it, I can find a link or a digital copy of the book for you. But it kind of shows this idea of a completely utopia country. Now, obviously, in the book things go wrong because realistically, according at least to some other philosophers, there is no such thing as a complete utopia where equality exists. We will always try to blame someone for our problems, or we need someone to blame. Thomas Hobbes called this the Leviathan theory. But in terms of philosophy, Marx's idea was literally just that. It was an idea on how he thought the working class people who tended to work for a very long period of time and didn't often always gain an awful lot would try to gain equal status with other people. It becomes a very different thing in Russia as time goes on, and what we now think of today as communism is not necessarily the same ideal, but you can see why that changes as we go through this topic. Now, the Who's Who's list would not be complete if it were not for Joseph Stalin. He is the man who takes up the mantle of power after Lenin's death. He did not want to spread communism everywhere. He didn't think it was feasible, purely because he was having enough trouble keeping control of his own country, never mind trying to control others, which is a little bit difficult, I think, to believe considering his actions during the beginning of the Cold War. But he wants socialism in one country, and that country is Russia. He wants a socialist state, basically nationalist pride, achievement over what Russia can do. He wants it to be like, wow, Russia is like naming lights, Russia is the best country ever, and he thought that people would come to revolution naturally if that's what they saw. But he wanted total economic and social transformation in Russia in order to catch up and overtake the West. He said that they were about 30 years behind the West, which was roughly accurate due to Nicholas's ineptitude to modernise, and he had to make that gap up in 10 years. And believe it or not, he did. He planned a revolution from above, but it came with a very, very high price, which is literally millions and millions of deaths. Stalin himself was a firm believer in such phrases as one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is simply a statistic, which means he was willing to make that sacrifice if it meant he got the Russia he had in mind. He created a totalitarian state, which means that basically the power was in the hands of just one small group, or just one man in this case, him. He had complete excessive control over everything, and anyone who questioned or went against him, he eradicated. He removed them from his life, he removed them from power, he removed them from history in some cases, and we will come back to that when we talk about Stalin at the other part of the topic, the third topic area. By the end of the 1930s, basically what he had managed to do was almost insurmountable. He had changed this backwards agricultural floundering nation into an industrial country. They were using hand tools when he took power. They are now using machinery to farm and to do things. Industry is booming, and not only that, he's created a country that is capable of taking on and ultimately defeating Hitler's Nazi Party as they advanced in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War as it was known in Russia. He also creates the nation that is the very first to put a person into space, ahead of the United States during the space race, and he formed the shape of the nation that pretty much stayed unchanged until 1980, when things started to change and capitalism was more kind of common and things like that. So final thoughts on the people. Marx certainly had the idea, but it was Lenin who made the October Revolution happen, and it was Lenin who laid the foundations of this communist state based on Marx's theory, loosely based on Marx's theory. However, it was Stalin who shaped it into this Soviet system that basically competed with the democratic capitalist world until ultimately the Russian communist group collapsed in 1991. So ultimately we're thinking then about why the Tsarist regime itself collapsed in 1917. Why during February 1917 did the Tsar actually lose control and lose power? Now we can take this back to Nicholas being crowned in 1894. At that point, people were so excited and so happy to have this new Tsar, because they did genuinely love the Tsar and his father before him, and they crowded around trying to see him, which unfortunately led to 1,200 people being crushed to death in a small riot in St. Petersburg, all trying to see him, which, believe it or not, is not actually a good start for a general ruler or a general leader of something. It's probably bad mojo or something, I don't really know, but it's not a good start anyway. 23 years later, he's been removed from power, and he and his family were prisoners due to the revolution in February 1917. Now we say the word prisoners quite loosely originally. They are not allowed to leave their holiday home in the palace, and they spend their time in the gated gardens and things like that being cared for without being allowed out, which is a fairly nice prisoner experience. This will turn south very, very quickly in October 1917 after the Bolsheviks take power, and then later on as things start to progress and the family become more of a threat. But again, we'll come back to that. He had survived the revolution already in 1905, the revolution that never was, and we'll talk about this more later. But he did not actually make the required changes to survive the next one. He promised the people changes that he didn't deliver on, so when February 1917 rolled round, the arguments they were making were just the same old ones that they had been making years previously, and they were no longer willing to listen to him. They'd given him the benefit of the doubt, they'd given him the chance to make a change, and he had not, so they basically got rid of him. Common theme here for everything that we have talked about so far: revolution. Again, we said that there are actually two full actual revolutions taking place in Russia during this time period. We're not counting 1905 because it was kind of like a false start revolution. It was like a rev of the revolution, but not quite a full one. The first one is known as the Russian Revolution, or the February Revolution, and takes place in February 1917, and the second is known as the Bolshevik Revolution, or the October Revolution, and takes place in October 1917. So we will look at these in a wee bit more detail. So first activity then of the week. This is a section from the first 2 pages of your textbook chapter, and there are a few tasks there about what a revolution actually is. So there's some information about that. A key fact about revolution is that they are always carried out by masses of people. Are they always going to be popular revolutions? Do they always have leaders or parties that organise things like that? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to specifically be looking at with the 3 revolutions, 1905 and the 2 in 1917, that we are debating about. Quite a pertinent historical debate about the revolutions in Russia at the moment is whether or not it is a popular revolution, and whether or not, because parties got involved in October, does it even actually deserve the title of revolution. So this kind of comes back to this idea of what you think a revolution actually is. So for this task, there are 5 questions for you to do. I want you just to write a note of what you think a revolution actually is, so in your own ideas. Using sources 1 to 4, they're in the textbook, but they're also on the next slides. You are going to think about what ideas Russia's revolution is being suggested by the sources. Question 3, do you think you can have a revolution without leaders? So give me your opinion on that. Question 4, it says, what do you think are the main causes of revolutions? So it says, look at the causes suggested below and rank them in order of importance according to the diagram on the right. So you're making a diamond 9. Add any others that you can think of. You don't have to do that, but you can use the 9 that are there. You put your most important one in the top square here. So you can draw the diagram out if you like, or you can just write it out, whatever you feel comfortable with. So your most important one would go there, and your least important one would go into the bottom one here. And then you kind of just try to build it up from whatever you think. You don't have to give a reason why you think that, but you just have to put the diamond 9 together. Question 5 asks you what aspects of society need to change in order to justify the term revolution. So is it a revolution if a new party take power? So if the Conservatives were to be replaced by Labour, is that a revolution? If it is not a revolution, what do we need to happen to justify calling it a revolution? Were the suffragettes campaigning for the vote and then getting the vote a revolution? If that's not the case, why not? So 5 answers to questions. There's no structure for these. You don't have to do them as inquiry skills style. You just have to answer the questions to give you more of an idea and a foundation of what revolution actually is. And you can see on the next couple of slides the sources that are there as well for you to use. So this is the first PowerPoint of the week. I will kind of post another one roughly about Wednesday, so again, if you could aim to finish off the tasks and things like that by the end of the week, that's fine. If you want to do them by, say, the Wednesday and then work on the next lot, that's fine as well. Any questions, let me know, and any concerns or just even thoughts that you have that you want to discuss, pop it into the channel and we can chat about it in general.